In this week's Torah reading, things fall apart. The beginning of the book of Numbers is great. The camps are set, the flags are set, the princes are ready, the Mishkan, the sanctuary, has been dedicated and it's functioning, and the people are ready to set forth on their march to the promised land. And then somewhere in the middle of this week's Parsha, it all just goes south. The people start to complain. They pine for Egypt. They want to rebel. Moses is frustrated. And everything just seems to be falling apart. What happened? What went wrong? What did they not have? And what can we find that will prevent that same thing from happening to us? So at the beginning of the Parsha, we meet Aaron, the high priest, who is a little bit distressed. According to the rabbis, something is upsetting him. What? The fact that the 12 princes of the tribes had just brought beautiful offerings to the dedication of the altar, and Aaron hadn't. He and his tribe, the Levites, had brought nothing, so he felt left out, he felt depressed. So Moses comforts him and says, "You have a greater portion because you get to light and to improve the lights of the menorah." How exactly is this a comfort? Well, according to some commentaries, it's a prophetic comfort, because the tabernacle and later the temple, which those princes had dedicated, when it was destroyed, the effect of their sacrifices was gone. But in the future, the descendants of Aaron would make their own dedication of the altar and make their own lighting of the menorah when they would find the 1 day's worth oil that burnt for 8 in the form of the Maccabees. And that outlasted the temple, because even to this very day we observe the Hanukkah. So there is a prophetic comfort to Aaron given by Moses. But if we don't want to resort to prophecy, can we find an answer within the verses themselves? I mean, after all, the high priest has a lot of other things he does that are important. I would say that the service on Yom Kippur, where he is the star and he is saving the Jewish people from sin and from being punished by bringing the atonement to them, I would say that that's very high up there. Why doesn't Moses comfort Aaron with that? Why the menorah? So let's take a look at the mystery of the inverted nuns that we have later in the Parsha. There are a pair of inverted nuns, and in between them are two famous verses. We recite them when we open the ark to take the Torah out, and when we bring the Torah back to put it back in the ark. Vayihi binsoa ha'aron, when the ark would travel, Vayomer Moshe, Moses would say, Kuma Hashem, rise up, O Hashem, v'yafutzu oyavecha, your enemies shall scatter, v'yanusu misanecha mipanecha, your haters shall run away from you. Uvenucho yomar, and when the ark would come back, then Moses would say, Shuva Hashem, bring back, O Lord, Rivavot Alfei Yisrael, the tens of thousands of Israel. That's within two inverted nuns. Why is that so? According to Rabbi Shimel ben Gamliel in the Gemara, the reason is because it doesn't belong there. That verse actually belonged earlier in the book of Numbers when the camps were being set up, but because there's bad stuff in the Parsha, as we said, we don't want it to come one after the other without any interruption, because then it would just be too much bad stuff. We want to separate the bad stuff from the bad stuff. So this little section comes right before the people start to complain, before they start to remember the delicacies that they would eat in Egypt, and Moses gets frustrated and complains and all of that. So these two things come, these two nuns and those two verses come right before that. What's the bad stuff before it? We'll have to take a look at that. Let's ask another couple of questions, and then we'll come to our answer. Now, after the Israelites had sinned by the golden calf, so Moses had immediately gone to God and prayed that God forgive the people, which he eventually did. But here, when the people are sinning and complaining, Moses doesn't beg forgiveness for them. Instead, he himself complains. He says, did I give birth to this people, that I have to carry them like a mother carries her infant? How can I bear the burden of this people? He's complaining about them. He's not asking God to have mercy on them. How come he doesn't ask God to have mercy on them? And a final question. Later on, God will tell him, after this complaint, here's the solution: get 70 people together, and the Spirit of God will come on those 70 people, and they will achieve prophecy. And then there were 2 prophets who remained in the camp prophesying there. One was named Eldad, the other one was named Medad. And this bothered Joshua, Yoshua ben Nun, Moses' disciple, who says to Moses, these two guys are in the midst of the camp. They didn't come with the rest of the prophets. They're staying in the camp and they're giving prophecy. Moshe, you should have them stop, cause them to cease and desist. But Moses says, no, this is wonderful. Wouldn't it be great if God's Spirit was on everybody? So in other words, Moses rejects Joshua's jealousy. And we need to understand, why did Moses reject Joshua's jealousy? What was the, you can't say a disagreement, because Moses was the teacher, Joshua was the student. What was the question Joshua was asking? And what was the answer that Moses gave? The entire issue can be found in one word, and that word is apathy. Apathy. Because the people, immediately after those nuns, the first thing they do, the Torah says, they were complaining badly. But we don't know what the complaint was. It doesn't say anywhere in the Torah exactly what they were saying. What was the issue? So the great Rabbi Abraham Twersky, a great psychologist, suggests that it wasn't anything in particular of importance that they were complaining about. They were simply malcontents. They were unhappy and they would complain about anything. They would seek any excuse to complain. Chronic complainers. Why so? How did this happen? Because, says Rabbi Twersky, they had been accustomed to being slaves in Egypt. It wasn't great, but it's what they knew, and they got into a routine. So why did they follow Moses out of Egypt? Well, they said, well, it's not great to be a slave. If accepting this religion is going to make things easier for us, so maybe we'll accept the religion and then we'll get out of slavery. Good. But they didn't do it with a burning fire. They did it with apathy. They said, okay, we'll check it out. But then when they got to Mount Sinai, they realized this is a lot more than they bargained for. This is an entire change of our entire way of life. And not just that, we're going to have to now march off and do battle with mighty nations. This isn't what we bargained for. And so they became embittered and they became malcontents, and they looked for any excuse to complain as a proof that things aren't going the way they were promised, and therefore this was a bad deal, and we want to go back to Egypt. Apathy. So Moses, he saw this. He understood that this was the issue. And he even saw it. So we have to ask, what is the bad stuff before? This exact issue was already showing its face. How so? The verse before simply states that the Israelites left Mount Sinai. But the rabbis say it's not that they just left Mount Sinai, it's how they left. They left Mount Sinai like a kid running away from school. That's how they left Mount Sinai. In other words, they left because they didn't want this burden on them. They felt that it was really not what they had bargained for. It was too much, and they were malcontents. Let's get out of this Mount Sinai place as quickly as possible. And I would say that there's also a hint in the story that's right connected to it of Yitro, Moses' father-in-law, who had come to be with Israel. And now he was saying to Moses, I'm going to go back to my land. And Moses tries to talk him out of it. He says, you knew our encampments in the wilderness. You should be for us eyes. What exactly is Moses saying to Yitro? This doesn't make sense. The fact that he knew their encampments is irrelevant. And being eyes, does that mean he's going to be their guide? He's going to tell them which way to go? They don't need Yitro for that. They have the divine cloud to show them which way to go. So what does it mean you knew our encampments? And besides, if I know where I've been, that doesn't necessarily mean I know where I'm going. If I know I was in Afula 10 minutes ago, that doesn't mean I can tell you how to get to Kochav Yair. Okay, so it seems to be irrelevant. But no, Moses was saying something else. Imagine a school, since we talked about children running away from school, imagine a classroom where the kids in the class are driving the teacher nuts. They're completely misbehaving. They're out of control. Then the principal walks into the room. Then all of a sudden the kids behave. And that for every moment that the principal is there, they're on their top behavior. But as soon as he leaves, pandemonium breaks out again. Well, Moses understood that the people were malcontent, and he saw that if they were unrestrained, it could go south in a very bad way. So he realized that as long as Yitro, such a respected figure, was there, the people were going to be on good behavior. The principal was in the room. But as soon as Yitro leaves, and that's what it means when he says, "You knew our encampments," because at every encampment that the Israelites had had, they had complained about something, usually the food, but they had complained and showed a somewhat rebellious, bitter, unhappy spirit. And Yitro knew this, and therefore Moses says to him, "You will be for us for eyes." What does it mean for eyes? Not that Yitro's going to show them where to go, but the people will look at Yitro. And because he is respected in their eyes, they will behave better. As soon as he left, things went south. So I think that it's apathy. And this would explain, by the way, what the content of the two verses in between those two nuns is. It's showing us what the journey of the Israelites should have been like had they gone with enthusiasm and with faith and complete devotion. And it also shows us that even if Yitro has left, we don't need Yitro for our own self-esteem. We only need Moses and Hashem, and then we're ready to go. So therefore, that's what happened. Now let's take a look at the solution afterwards. Moses is complaining. Why is he not praying? He's complaining because he's saying, I can't inspire these people. I can't carry their burden. I can't lift them up that much. So God says, I'll show you how to do it. I'll give you 70 elders, and they will receive prophecy. A person who receives prophecy is a person with the fire of devotion in their heart, and they will help you lift up the people. And that's exactly what Moses says to Joshua, because Joshua didn't like what Eldad and Medad were saying, which they were saying, by the way, was that Moses was going to die and that Joshua was going to lead the people into the land. So Joshua himself was very uncomfortable. He didn't like what they were saying. But Moses says to them, to Joshua, he says, what they're saying, if we agree or disagree, we can solve that in the Beis Medrash, in the study hall. The main thing is that they are inspired by prophecy. We need a people that cares. The weakest one at the Passover Seder is the one who doesn't even know how to ask a question. So the solution is fire, is excitement and devotion. And that's exactly what Aaron's job was. When he lit the menorah, says Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, it wasn't enough to just touch the wicks with the flame and let it sputter into existence. He had to hold the flame there until the wicks themselves were burning fully. This is a metaphor for the teacher. The teacher shouldn't just give the information to the student and then go home. The teacher has to stand there and make sure that the student themselves becomes inspired, becomes on spiritual fire to shed his own light. In other words, the princes who brought the 12 offerings were certainly inspired, but Aaron's task is greater because he's going to create an entire nation of inspired princes by his important contribution of lighting and keeping the light of Torah, of inspiration, burning. The worst enemy we have is apathy. We need to be excited and thrilled and completely devoted to all of the commandments that we fulfill, and this is how we will successfully march forward into the promised land. Shavuot Tov.